Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And whether you are newer around here or you've been listening for a long time, I want to begin by saying welcome and thanks. Now, most of you know, I usually like to keep these intros very informal. I like to spend a little time just reflecting on the week and saying what's up. But I am going to forego this usual ritual today. And the reason is that every once in a while, I have a conversation with someone that feels so significant. My usual fun-loving, informal banter feels like a waste of time. And today is one such day. You've already seen the title of the episode, and what I would say there is that it really isn't just about God. I mean, it's partly about that because I'm having a conversation about questions of spirit and consciousness, and whenever you use the word God, those inquiries become very crystallized. And I've been trying to have conversations about this on the show. As you know, usually towards the latter part of a conversation, I bring it up by using the word intuition or spirit, or if I can, I will say the word God just to see if the person I'm speaking with will go there or not. And frankly, very few people are open to having a conversation about spirit and God. Especially among yoga teachers, because I think a lot of times yoga teachers, when they're going on a podcast and speaking publicly, you want to present yourself in a way that would ingratiate you to the broadest spectrum of people. So if you lead with words like spirit or God, there's a whole swath of people who are just going to immediately write you off. But if you don't use the word spirit or God, and you find other language, but you hold that in yourself and they come to your class, sometimes that person who would have normally written you off, they have an experience in your class that actually leads them to that without you ever saying it. So the words often get in the way. So even people who do have experiences or hold certain values about God and themselves will often never talk about it publicly. So getting people to have this conversation is not an easy thing because it's just such a hard conversation to have, and you're worried about what other people might think because you have to work through it in real time. In a way, I can sit by myself and think about these things, but it isn't until I try to say them to someone else and see how they respond or have them disagree with me that it really gets fleshed out. It becomes something real, not just ideas in my head, but a belief or value that I might hold. So, in any case, my guest today is Peter Blackaby, and he is certainly someone who is not only capable but willing to go to a vulnerable place and have a real conversation about what I think is perhaps the most significant thing that we could be talking about in many regards. At the beginning of the conversation, I say something about how it came about. And it's really a conversation that I think you may want to not be multitasking while you listen to. It's one of those that you might want to give your attention to, I think. And let me not forget, this is important. I want to make a point of suggesting that you also listen to the outro to today's conversation. And the reason is that Peter and I had an email exchange after we finished recording where we came to something that we didn't get to in the conversation. And I think we both wished that we had. But as I said, we were really working through something in real time together, and we didn't get to it until after we finished recording. So listen, I'm going to read the email exchange that we had in the outro because I feel like it was such an important end note to the conversation that wants to be included. So if you make it all the way through to the outro, because I guess might be some of you who might not be interested in this, but if you get all the way through to the outro, don't just hit stop. Listen to the outro so that you can hear the email exchange we had after and where we ended up getting to. Okay, so you can hear maybe I'm really excited about sharing this. I really do think it's one of the most significant conversations I've ever recorded for this show. Real quick before we get to it, I would feel remiss if I didn't take a moment to express gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I want to express thanks to longtime friends of the show, Marie-Helene Gauchard and Elisa Mullen-Verney. What's up, Marie-Helene and Elisa? Appreciate you both. And listen, I'm not really supposed to say this, but we have some exciting things coming for podcast premium subscribers in the next few weeks. So you can stay tuned and I'll announce that. I wasn't even supposed to say anything, but I can't help myself. It's exciting. Things are happening with podcast premium. If you're new around here and you don't know, the most recent 52 episodes are always available in their full length on the public feed. We do also have a podcast premium subscription, which gives you access to the full archives, is the way that you support the show, and new stuff coming, yet to be announced. So it's choose your rate. You can cancel it at any time. And if you want to learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, along with all the other stuff that I have on offer, I've got weekly classes and weekly discussions that you can be a part of if you want. All the stuff that I'm doing can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I will touch base with you on the other side. Like I said, I'm gonna read that email exchange, but let's go ahead and get to it and listen to this conversation that I had with Peter Blackaby. Hello?
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Peter.
You good?
I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good too.
I'm already recording. We just begun. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
It's lovely to speak with you again. It's been a while. I think the first time you were here was in 2017.
Right, yeah, that's a while.
And then you came back again a year later. And then I had you on with Bernie that one time.
That's right.
That was some years back. And so here we are, many years later. And I love what brought us back together. It does feel like it actually connects to our earlier conversations.
Okay.
You know, when I first brought you on, you were calling what you were doing intelligent yoga. I don't know if you're still calling it that or not. We actually had a conversation about that title, if I remember. Yeah. And what was interesting to me about that, and what I asked you about that title, was I had that experience of practicing with you at the breathing project that one time.
Oh, yeah.
And I still do that practice of down dog that you did, where we never stayed in it. We only came into it and came out of it. Like the whole practice was coming in and coming out, but we never stayed in it, which I loved. And I still do that sometimes. And you also made that wonderful comment that I've used so many times. I always credit you about how it's not important to teach a horse how to do the splits.
Okay.
So those are some really deeply wonderful gems I got early on. And What was interesting to me was that you were calling it intelligent yoga, which to me implied some kind of like intellectualizing. But the practice with you was so experiential and not at all intellectual in a certain way. And so what's funny now is all these years later, you posted something on your yoga discussion group on Facebook, which I have to say was a very synchronicitous thing that I came upon that post. I very rarely go on Facebook.
Yeah.
And one might even say it was divinely inspired, Peter, which we can get to. But what was so lovely about it is that you had listened to the conversation I had with John Sturck recently.
Yeah.
and you were picking up on this interesting thread about spirituality. You, in fact, started by saying, I listen to Jay's podcast sometimes, and it seems like he may be going through something of a spiritual religious turn, which I'm not denying, but to me, in a way, it's not been a turn. And in fact, that's pretty much always been there. It's always been part of my practice. Mm-hmm. It's just not something I ever talked about.
Okay.
And, I'll give you an example of that. And this is a little bit of a long-winded setup, but it's with purpose. I've been chanting at the beginning and the end of my classes for 25 years. Uh-huh. And I never thought of that as prayer. I thought of it as making sounds, the Sanskrit sounds, and they would have a resonance, and it would make me feel a certain way. Yeah. And it was the feeling that the chanting gave me, like the somatic experience of doing the chanting, is why I did it. And I didn't even think of it as being about spirit or God. It was just about an experiential ritual that I did. But for all intents and purposes, you could certainly make a case that chanting is pointing to what most people would think of as religious thought,
Uh-huh.
So in any case, all of this is to say that you brought up a number of different isms, essentialism, panpsychism. I hadn't heard a lot of these before, honestly.
All right.
So I guess I'm curious, one, do you still use the word intelligent yoga to describe your yoga? And two, what was it about the conversation with John that made you want to start a further conversation?
Okay. Intelligent yoga, actually, it's just strange. I think it's possibly a poor title for a book. I was really referring to the intelligence of the body more than I was an intellectual kind of intelligence, although there's obviously a kind of overlap between thought and bodies and
intelligence.
Yeah, just generally, what do we mean by intelligence? I think a lot of people, it could sound a bit elitist or a bit smug, So maybe it wasn't the best title for a book, but it's actually, it's worked out okay. When I run courses, I call them humanistic yoga courses. Intentionally, I picked that word intentionally. Because I'm coming from I want to clarify the perspective I'm coming from. What got me interested in, because I like John, and I tuned into it because I've got a lot of time for John, and actually all the way through the conversation I was nodding and generally going, yeah. There wasn't, you couldn't put a fact paper between really much of what you said and how I feel about it. Perhaps and it was you who brought in the word God, I think, not John. And
he was saying non-material, which is a word that you picked up on.
Well, I think that, this comes to the kind of, it becomes a very interesting conversation, and I think it really is a good conversation to try to clarify one's use of language, because non-material can mean a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue all kinds of thoughts and feelings are non-material. Even my voice landing in your ears is non-material. No one can get hold of my voice and put it in a box. So there is stuff that is non-material. All the parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that I can't access to me is non-material. I'm aware of things like particles from outer space that pass right through my body, neutrinos, that are non-material in all kind of meanings of the word to me of material. But they still actually are dependent on the phenomenological world to exist. A magnetic field can't exist without a magnet, even though I can't see or feel with my body magnetism. So there are some non-material things that one can discuss, and things like consciousness. is probably the knife edge of all these things. Is the kind
right.
of is the razor's edge on
Yes.
which we kind of talk about these things, because if you're a panpsychist, consciousness would exist without human beings. If you're an evolutional theorist and a non-panpsychist, you'd say actually you need to be an animal or a human being to have consciousness. You need at least a brain of some sort to become conscious. So I guess on that level, there is an element of belief about which side of the coin you flip. And it's quite difficult to argue whether a stone has got consciousness or not. So you have once you start moving into the non-material, and here if I talk about the non-material, I'm not talking about things that are dependent on the material. So, for example, something like prana in yoga seems to exist without the need for the material. They would argue that prana exists, or in more Western thought, a vital force. In naturopathy was a concept that I was taught. There are many ideas that, or God, the idea of a creator God, things that you can't prove or disprove. I can't set up an experiment to prove the existence of any of these things. They don't register on any kind of calibration machine, so they become a matter of belief, and to some extent, then they become less interesting as a discussion topic because they're just simply about belief. Do you believe it or not? And if you do believe it, I'm probably not going to change anybody's mind. But where I started with this whole thing, and I got the feeling John did too, because as you went through the conversation, he kind of explained something about, he said something like we all started off stretching and moving our bodies and pushing and pulling and breathing deeply and holding our breath, And these have very broad and deep sensory experiences. And you often notice this with beginners, don't you? You get on the mat, they do their dog pose, and they're going, ooh, ouch, this is hurting the back of my legs. Or I feel I'm in discomfort, or they're finding it, tricky to do some of the postures because their bodies haven't practiced much. And the unfamiliar bumps into their body. And because they're not very skilled in the movements, they often feel quite strong physical sensations. And then we probably all felt a bit like that when we started yoga. And then you refine your practice, you repeat it, you pay attention to it, and the movements become smoother. Your discrimination of sensation becomes more subtle. And this process of refining and refining and refining sensory experience is what I think John was leading to. And if we take this, if you take the perspective I'm taking, and you can take me up on this at any point you like, how do we get any sensory input is through our sensory nervous system. We know what they are. We've sort of demarcated them as proprioceptive, interoceptive, exteroceptive. These are the main, and maybe nociceptive, these four main systems that inform us about what's going on in the world. And they have particular purposes. So exteroceptive sensory input is to help us navigate the world. Have eyes, ears, sense of smell. But it's about me in a world, how to survive the world so I don't bump into a tree or fall off a cliff, or bump into my neighbours, things like that. And then I have a proprioceptive system to help me navigate my body in that world. So, what am I doing with my body? Can I move it well, or is it doing what I intend it to do? And I have an interoceptive nervous system to tell me whether my organism is in some kind of existential threat from hunger or thirst or defecation or micturition or tiredness and fatigue. I feel these things interoceptively, and I need to adjust my behavior to keep myself well. And I have a nociceptive system to tell me if my body's been damaged in any way and I need to attend to it. So, and of course, all these systems are here to keep me safe on a planet, in contact with people, to reduce threat, to, in a sense, they're all about homeostasis. How do I keep alive in the world on a planet? So on one level, you can think of the sensory nervous system as a homeostatic system to maintain an integrity of my body as optimally as possible in the world. And it makes a lot of sense to learn to listen to your sensory nervous system if you think of it like that. If you think that is its process. So these are all discrete nervous systems, and you can look at them under a microscope. You can actually see the nerve pathways. They have different tracts. They're carried along different types of nerves, and they don't carry different information, but they carry information to the brain that it sorts it out as different interpretations. So generally, my optic nerve is interpreted in terms of vision, and my proprioceptive nerve is movement or stress or strain, and so on and so forth. And then you have other feelings, of course. We have emotions, which aren't carried along in particular nerves. They seem to be an emergent property of how we interpret all these feelings.
So you don't think feelings happen in our nerves?
Don't think what?
You don't think our feelings are happening in our nerves? Their feelings are only happening in our brains?
They happen in our brain, but they don't. Whereas my optic nerve, carries a message. My exteroceptive nerves, my optic nerves, my olfactory nerves, they're carried in specific nerve pathways. The optic nerve, the olfactory nerve, the auditory nerve. I haven't got the same nerve for love or hate or Schadenfreude or any other. So emotions are the way the brain interprets sensory data and comes up with another feeling that we experience in our bodies. And they seem to be predicated on the physicality in the moment. So people like Antonio Damasio would say that when things happen to us, we have what you could call what he describes as motoric output. So the world is happening around me, and what's happening constantly is I'm responding to the world motorically through the motor nervous system, through the efferent nervous system. And that's to my muscles. So my muscles change their tonus on a moment-by-moment basis. But also, this motor output goes to my organs and to the organs of secretion. And my organs will secrete either things like serotonin and dopamine, or maybe, if it's more alarming, adrenaline and cortisol. And that will change my physiology. So it will change my physical state. And that physical state will create something that I've historically claimed with some kind of experience that I would call an emotion. So emotions, according to people like Damasio and Lisa Feldman Barrett, these are two leading sort of theorists in the creation of consciousness and emotions, will say that emotions are predicated on body states. They don't exist out of thin air, and they're predictive states based on how we've labeled these physical states in the past. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I'm in agreement with everything that you've said. I think you're right. I think John was pointing to this idea of refining sensory experience, and that people I know and myself who've spent a lot of time in our lives doing that often observe what you refer to as the intelligence of the body. That there's something that I have an inherent healing mechanism that knows what to do. That there's you can observe this to be true, and I also appreciate what you're saying, that consciousness and these spiritual or religious experiences, if we're calling them that, they're dependent on me having a body and existing in time and space to experience them.
Well, I would argue that, that would certainly be the perspective I would take.
Well, what I would say to you is, in your comment, you said you were specifically looking at the word, you said our use of language, and you said the use of the word spiritual hangs on the belief of something other.
Okay.
And that's a dualism. And I really honed in on that, and that the idea that it has no relationship to matter. And I don't know that that's what I'm saying, that the intelligence that's at work in your body, yes, it is dependent on the fact that you have a body, but that intelligence is what is that? What is the natural, miraculous function that takes place in our bodies and in nature that just seems to have its own intelligence to it, often beyond our own ability to comprehend, that's certainly working through our tissues? Even whether we decide it's dependent on it or not, there's some kind of force there, isn't there? Or what is that? If it's not a force, what's the intelligence?
Well, let's try and circle around this a bit. Let's think, on one level, we could be quite prosaic about this and say, if we engage with the world, feelings come up and they disappear. Some things make us feel comfortable, some things make us feel uncomfortable. And I'm very interested in uncomfortable feelings. Obviously, of the body, they have a very clear purpose. They usually tell us to shift our position. If I've sat on my foot for too long, it becomes uncomfortable. Then obviously the thing I do is move my foot. If I'm acting intelligently with my body, I don't ignore it. Damasio makes a very strong argument for uncomfortable emotions as being social signals in a way to modify or to at least reflect on our behavior. So if I start to feel slightly angry about something, then what it's asking me, in a sense, something's happened in the world that's triggered a response in me that I'm now labeling as anger. And it's useful for me to try and clarify what it is that's made me angry, to reflect on that a bit and say, well, is that reasonable? Is this thing that's happened, has someone stolen something from me and I'm a bit pissed off? Or am I angry because I just can't accept somebody else's point of view, and I'm just being a bit of a dogmatist? And that kind of anger, I think, is at least, these uncomfortable feelings are there to help us reflect on our behavior to see, are these feelings, do they fit? So, a good one for me, and I don't know if John talked about this, but it may be in a conversation you have with someone. Something that was very important to me, a significant one for me, was a feeling of defensiveness. I remember teaching a class once and someone said something to me and I had a feeling of defensiveness. Now, that feeling was something like going a bit hot and cold, slight sweat, my heart rate going up a little bit. In other words, physically I felt uncomfortable. And what I should have done in that circumstance was to think, what am I defending? Why has it made me feel uncomfortable? And to maybe even have said that, that conversation you've just said now, I feel a bit uncomfortable. I need to think about that, why I'm feeling uncomfortable about that conversation. So feelings arise for these reasons to usually motivate us to change our behavior or modify our behavior. We don't want to sit with uncomfortable feelings. You don't want to stay sitting on your foot because damage might occur. If I have an argument with my wife and I feel uncomfortable afterwards, it's motivating me to try and mend the argument somewhere. Or if I just try and ignore it, it'll come back a bit louder, or we'll still be angry the next day and it'll produce another bout of anger. So those kind of feelings have a real use to them. And we could talk about a skillful living as being a way of navigating the world where you manage to navigate it and reduce the amount of friction and discomfort, not by avoiding things, but by navigating them more skillfully. So I think one of the aspects that yoga has for us, if you one of the intelligence, you said, what is this force? Now, people who live the world, live very skillfully, I think, and do this very well, seemed to go through life more comfortably whilst navigating difficult things or have better answers for the difficult questions that other people struggle with, because they've reflected on their behavior, they've understood stuff about themselves, and now don't get caught up in a kind of belief or a dogma that they're caught in that creates the friction in our life. So I think there's something there, just about living skillfully by noticing how your feelings change, responding to those feelings as helpfully as possible. I'm not talking here about avoiding uncomfortable things or trying to get out of, the feeling of grief if someone dies. I'm not talking about that. These are all very appropriate feelings. I'm talking about the ones that make us, ruminate in the night, wake up in the night and think, oh God, that dinner party I went to and I said so-and-so, and now what do people think? Those thoughts that go around your head. Mm-hmm. That's usually because we didn't listen carefully enough, we didn't engage skillfully enough, we maybe put our view across without really hearing the other person. So those kind of things I think are deeply helpful. So there is that domain that I think in yoga we can really improve our lot by learning how to notice discomfort, see what it means to us, and navigate it more skillfully. We could come back to this. And then there is this other thing that happens in a yoga practice. And in the practice, we're trying to get to a place where we remove a lot of those things, I would argue. So we learn to do our dog poses and our back bends, or our lying on the floor, our sitting. And we become quiet because we reduce the noise. We reduce the noise from our nervous system. We become immersed in the sensory. This is something I really like that John says. He said, it's all about sensation. And I completely agree with him, absolutely about that. It's all about sensation. And when you drop all the other stuff away, so you've found some way to be in your body that's comfortable. And then what are you left with? And I think this is where you were getting to towards the end of your conversation with John. And you can arrive at a profoundly still place. And there are two words in the English language that circle around this theme. One is an oceanic feeling. And a lot of people have talked about this. And this is often described as the feeling of merging with the universe. The transcendence of your own ego, the
rhythms of the universe, yes.
Well, the recognition that you transcend the boundaries of your skin, if you like, your individuality dissolves into the universe. And I have a lot of time for this because actually, even intellectually, when you think about it, the idea of separateness is clearly a mistake. You can't separate a person from the world and hope that they survive. If you separate a baby from its mother, it doesn't thrive. I can't live in a world that doesn't have oxygen. I am not separate. I'm completely dependent on the universe that I live in for my own well-being, and the universe, to some extent, isn't dependent on me, but absorbs me as part of its nature. So,
well, let me stop you for a second, because you just you got to where I think where the post that you posted comes from, because when you talked about just now this idea of transcendence and being separate. Yeah, that's where I'm in agreement with you. We're not in disagreement there.
No.
I think that's why, in yoga, there's like ascetic and householder paths, and the ascetic path is a way of kind of removing yourself from situations where you have to have difficult emotions or whatever. Mm. And then to live in the world, yes, I think this is the boon of yoga for people living in the world, is this way of learning to, as one use of the word, more intelligently or skillfully navigate our ways through our lives. Yeah. And I love the way that you talked about how the practice would help us do that.
Yeah.
But I still didn't really hear the answer to my initial question, which had to do with the idea that there's an innate intelligence in our bodies, which you seem to acknowledge. And what is that innateness that somebody would observe when they make themselves quiet. If we agree that it's not separate, that we don't have to transcend to some other place to feel it. Let's start with that. Like, because I'm in agreement. I don't believe in that kind of dualism or separating myself from my sensory reality either. I'm in agreement with you. Well, but there's something that, and John and I were also talking about it in terms of being teachers as intuition, as the things that come through you as a teacher when you're teaching that you didn't plan.
Yeah.
Like, so the innate intelligence of your body and its just natural function and being released and present in your teaching to the point where things seem to occur that you could not have planned or thought of in advance is kind of what I'm pointing to. What is that? Let's not call it a force. Let's throw that word out. What is it? What's that?
That's practice.
Practice? That's it. But I know practice is what brings it about. But the phenomena of words coming out of your mouth that seem to perfectly fit the moment, and people come up to you after and be like, oh my God, you said that thing. You had never said it before in your life. Yeah. The reality of that happening, that's what I was talking with John about. Like, where does that come from? Where is that information coming from? It's not like I can point to a source and say, I read that in this book, or I learned that from this particular teacher. It was an expression that came through.
Yeah, because your mind was open.
To what? Open to what?
A response. Think of this another way. I was listening, there's a very nice book by a guy called Dan Eagleman recently. It's called Live Wired. He was explaining about how a tennis player, for example, absolutely brilliant tennis player, Olympic tennis player, a top athlete, will hone all his strokes, practice, know all the strokes inside out. But when he comes to play a match against someone who's equally good, there will be times when he'll have to come up with something novel. And because he's honed all his basic skills, the emergence of the novel shot, the one that is astounding, the one that no one knows how he pulled it out, how he did it, or the footballer who does an overhead bicycle kick, not because he knows he's going to do it, his body reacts. There is a new skill that emerges when you've honed your body over and over again. Now, in yoga, I sometimes think that what we're doing is learning how to keep our minds open to respond to questions and thoughts that come up from a way of being in the world where you're trying to reduce dogmatism in your thinking, where you're trying to keep an openness in your behavior.
Yes, that does seem to be an essential element, that there's no dogma and to be open to it. Yes.
Yeah. And if you're really practicing, you see, if you take it the other way around, if you're a dogmatist, if you just have a belief about the world and everything is seen through a lens, it could be a religious lens, a political lens, a philosophical lens, and you can only respond in a very particular way. Your limit to people's questioning will always be bent, refracted through the lens of the glasses you're wearing.
Right. If that lens is a non-dogmatic lens too. Well, it's all a lens. That's another lens. The lens that we're taking together where we say, let's not have any dogma. That's also just a lens of perception, isn't it?
Well, it's okay. It's a lens that can let more light in.
I agree. I'm in complete agreement.
So you have more you have a wider array
a wider spectrum of light to come in.
Of course, you can't, still to some extent your subjective nature, but our capacity for opening our subjective nature to wider scrutiny and to wider thoughts is, I think, the practice of yoga. To become not so open-minded that your brains fall out, as someone once said, but to keep a kind of openness that you don't feel wrong-footed by people's questions, or you can come up with you must have done this when you might chew over a problem for a while and think about something, and then you're taking a shower, you're taking the dog for a walk, you're having a cup of coffee, suddenly the answer emerges. that seems to be a phenomena that happens. Einstein used to talk about it, of really thinking about something first. The practice, if you like, gives rise to the ability to more spontaneously come up with answers that make some kind of sense. And, yoga is that practice, as far as I see it. It's a big part of the practice to reduce the dogmatism, but still be paying a lot of attention. So you're not just saying anything goes, because clearly everything doesn't go. And this is why these conversations are quite interesting, because the other word that I didn't mention, I talked about oceanic feelings, which are commonly, perceived as these feelings of either becoming incredibly, noticing your infinitesimally small nature in the vastness of the universe. That almost dissolving into nothing because you just realize you are just a speck. That is one word, but the other word is numinous, which is often used in a very similar kind of way. But when you look at the definitions of numinous, it's the idea that you're coming into contact with something wholly other, is often the way it's described. Something unspeakable of. And these two things I think are quite close, but I think they're quite different. And because the second one, the numinous, suggests to me a kind of duality. There is something wholly other that is not of the material. I can understand.
Does it have to be, Steve, does it have to be other? Does it have to be bigger? See, let me throw another thing in here. Because one of the reasons why I'm even having these conversations on the show, frankly, I am in agreement, and I remember Leslie Kaminoff talked about this too, that like when I ask people about intuition or like that moment in class where something comes out of you, I've gotten the same answer that you just gave, which is all of your previous experiences and conditioning have led to that moment. So something spontaneous arises, but it arises out of all the experiences that you've given yourself up into that moment. It doesn't necessarily come from anything else or some outside intelligence. It's just a natural result of your accumulated experience and knowledge. Sure. I can accept that. And that I could debate that further, and we can if we want. But what I want to point to is that for me, this also comes out of, frankly, the last few years where we collectively faced new kinds of challenges. I had many personal challenges in my own life. And there were moments where I was down on my knees and feeling hopeless and needed strength, and felt that strength came from something bigger than me, that there's something larger than just my own individual consciousness trying to figure everything out and have these conversations, that there's something bigger. And that's kind of letting myself be held by that and not sure how to define it or what words to use, know what I mean, to describe it. But that in these moments, there was something that happened, a feeling of guidance, a feeling of nurturing or comfort that came, a numinous experience that doesn't have to be something other. But something bigger. Isn't there something bigger at work in this life than our own individual souls or consciousness?
Does it have to be?
Doesn't have to be.
There's clearly, the life goes on.
Regardless.
When you and I die, the world will carry on. And when human beings are taken off the universe, if the whole human race dies.
So that moment, that religious experience, if we want to call it that, which I generally would not. That's what I'm saying. I wouldn't even think of that as religious because I don't identify with any organized religion. But that religious experience is just some electrical firings in my brain based on my experiences. You see, that's where it gets to a materialistic view of our existence, where those religious experiences are just, firings in my brain because I have a nervous system, my proprioception, and all the things that you talked about at the beginning of this conversation. Those are just leading to this experience that I had, but it's not really anything more than that. And I'm just making it something into that because of magical thinking or whatever.
Yeah.
That's it. You see, that's a materialistic view. That's a view, and I would say a reductionist view.
Oh.
Wouldn't you? Because you're reducing my experience, my sensorial experience, to just the material. And you're saying, oh, you're making it more than material, but it's not.
You see, I find this really fascinating. That in your use of the word just, there's a diminution of that perspective.
Well, only because if I think of it as something more, you've diminionized. You've done the same thing to me by saying that my experience is not more than material. You've diminished my experience. You've diminished my experience and made me just deluded or something.
Oh, no, I didn't mean that at all.
I mean, but that's the implication, that I must just be, not seeing things clearly or something, or I'm kind of in a delusion or something.
No, I don't mean that at all. Well, if you take, can I just deal with the materialist side?
Sure.
Because, I would call myself a physicalist or materialist. I would, that I think the world is just a phenomenal world. I'm a phenomenologist in that sense. But I still find it amazing that some people kind of shrug and go, well, is this it? And when I think about how you and I are talking, this collection of atoms talking to that collection of atoms that have taken, 13 billion years to get here through a whole process of extraordinary phenomena of moving from energy to matter to biology to consciousness. This strikes me as almost magical thinking. You couldn't make it up. If science hadn't explained it.
The material world is very magical. I completely agree.
And to, when you reflect on it, and I look at the beauty in the world and the emotions that can be aroused in me by all the things that I encounter, I'm always a bit surprised when people feel they need something else. But I would say this. I'm also absolutely aware that our subjective experience is shaped by the environments that we grow up in. So I will interpret the world differently to someone who lived 10,000 years ago, and I will interpret the world differently to the guy next door because he's had different experiences to me. And the meaning I give to my experiences are going to be different. And you certainly can't say one person's meaning is right and one person's meaning is wrong. That would be a very bigoted way, a very dogmatic way of viewing it. Every single person on the planet has a different way of making sense of experience. Before Darwin came along, no one understood about evolution. Everybody believed in, some kind of a god, or nearly everybody, and would interpret all their experiences through that kind of religious thinking, because the amount of information they had was, in a particular way. The neuroscientist Anil Seth talks about the way we interpret perception as being Bayesian inference, meaning that we make the best guess that we can about what sensory experience means to us. So, depending on the kind of input you've had over your life and the input I've had over my life, we will come up with our best guess about what sensory experience means. Now, for many of these things, we can be in complete agreement. If we see a table, my best guess is that's a table, and you'll probably guess the same thing as I would. One of the ways he talks about this is he says, if you look down your road and it was quite a long road and coming up the road was a gorilla, Bayesian inferencing would probably make you think it wasn't a gorilla, it was an old man to start with, because it would be much more likely than a gorilla. But as you got closer and you got more information and you could see the shape of the beast more and more, you might go through a few kind of changes. You may think it was a hobbling old man, then you might think it was a person wearing a rucksack, and then you might think it was a person just with very long arms. But eventually you'd have to concede it was a gorilla. as your kind of information got richer, and there became less doubt about what you were seeing. And we do this all the time. We infer from our sensory data what that data means to us. And we can't generalize here in a sense, I mean, we can generalize about a lot of things because we all have.
Well, listen, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but like, it seems to me in the same way that as I got closer to the gorilla and perceived it to be a gorilla rather than something else, a lot of times as people come closer to their sensorial experiences and get closer to it, they perceive them to be something other than what just the material function that you're describing. And I guess what I want to go back to something you said was that you said that the implication was that the idea that someone's going to receive some guidance from a divine wisdom, or it seems to me the implication also is that there's no universal consciousness, or that there's an idea of universal consciousness, that comes out of a need for something else, that this material world is not enough. And I don't think that's the case. I think the material world is as all-encompassing and magnificent as you seem to describe. But I think that there are a lot of people, and I guess I'm including myself, and it's still an open question for me, just to say, I have experienced, like, we're just observing our experiences and then acknowledging to ourselves, hey, you know what? I do think that there's something to what's happening here that's bigger, that encompasses more, not other or separate, but more than just this material realm that you seem to be limiting us to.
Well, no, again, I want to come back to saying, the sensory input is neutral, isn't it? Interpretation is everything. But
sensory input can't be neutral because it's tacked to an individual person's perceptions. You started by saying we can't have sensory input without a mind and a consciousness too, can we?
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, what I meant by neutral was I can't generalize from the particular. What I can, and perhaps this is the nub of the thing that when I'm teaching yoga, all I can ask people to do is notice what they feel. What it means to them is completely up to them. And I wouldn't bring words in that might lead them somewhere different. So if you use the word God, that has a huge amount of meaning to a lot of people. If
you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.